Welcome, welcome, welcome. And please continue to let us know where you're coming in from. We see Sloan here from CARE. Sloan, it's always wonderful to see you as well. Love your work. It's not always enough to go looking for the place we belong. Sometimes we need to make that place. That is a quote by Sangu Mandana, The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. Today we are talking about belonging, about how to ensure the workforce with all of its policies, practices, and expectations, how its very culture can be made into a place where adolescents belong, where they can bring their best selves, their best thinking, their highest contributions, and add to the intergenerational space that is the workforce. Good afternoon to all of you, and welcome to our April Learning Series session. My name is Uva Coles, and I am Chief Learning Officer with Spring Point Partners. We are beyond thankful that you are here and hopeful that the weather has been treating you well. Before the session, we were just talking a little bit about where we are and how good the weather is for some of us. And so we were lifting a little bit of that, but beyond hope, we're also lifting you in our thoughts if you have been adversely affected by some of the harsher weather patterns across the country. So no matter how you arrive today, what we hope is that you can leave our time together a little more settled, a little more knowledgeable in this topic, and feeling like you belong in our community of learners in an even larger way. For those of you who are new to Spring Point Partners, there is a link in the chat that can tell you more about us, but I will share that we are a social impact organization rooted in Philadelphia and with a national footprint that allows us to support, center, and invest in transformational leaders, networks, and solutions that power community change and advance justice. That just means we look for really good people, many of you in the room today. Try to learn more about what you are doing in alignment with our priority areas, and then try to create some spaces for your work to be amplified as we support you as well. And our learning series are optional sessions for our partners and others beyond our ecosystem who may benefit from being in community to learn from thoughtful, human-centered leaders who are shifting narrative in their respective fields. If you have been in our learning series before, you know that this year we are exploring 4 major areas: leadership and community well-being. We're also looking at transformational transitions, effective storytelling and narrative change, and finally, impact with nuanced measurement. More on that last one for our next session in May. All themes for learning sessions are undergirded with human-centeredness and equity. And today's session, Belonging in the Workplace, Building an Adolescent-Friendly Culture, is part of our leadership and community well-being theme. It will be guided by 2 speakers. First, we have Dr. Joanna Williams from the Search Institute and the National Research Council on Adolescence, who will share research-based insights on adolescent development and behaviors. She will then be followed by Julia Hillengas, Executive Director of PowerCorps, who will share her organization's practical application of building a culture of belonging for the young people she works with and supports. So this is how we're going to do this. Pretty straightforward. We're going to do some introductions. I'll talk a little bit more about our speakers, and then we're going to turn our attention to you as well. So each speaker will talk for about 20 minutes or so. We'll have an opportunity for you to ask a few questions if they're pressing and can't wait in the moment. Then we'll bring our second speaker, who will also talk for another 20 minutes, followed by 5 minutes of your more immediate questions. And then finally, I want to make sure that both of them have an opportunity to be in conversation with each other and with you. So we will open the floor for all of you to engage with both of them together. And from there, we will just wrap up at the very end with some announcements. Along the way, of course, we are hoping that you engage with each other and with us and our speakers. So feel free to use the chat. Memorialize your questions, your thoughts, and your resources as well. If things come up that you may be able to help others with, feel free to include that in the chat as well. So while I read our introduction or bios for our speakers, not full bios, those will be in the link if they're not already in the chat, I would love for you to answer or respond to this prompt. Organizational belonging is, I'll say that one more time. Organizational belonging is. You can answer that in any way that makes sense for you, but we would love just to learn a little bit about how you are thinking about belonging in the workplace. And maybe you have absolutely no idea just yet how to define that, and that's why you're here. That is okay as well. But if you have some thoughts on it, we would love to hear your thoughts. Organizational belonging is in the chat. If you have a minute, we would love your responses. While you do that, let me adequately introduce you to our speakers. Dr. Joanna Williams is Senior Director of Research at the Search Institute and the National Research Council on Adolescence. Beyond her extensive credentials and research experience, I will mention that her roles as a teacher, as youth development program staff member, and her positionality in schools and community programs and child welfare settings, as well as her work as tenured faculty at University of Virginia and Rutgers, where she focused on the interplay of racial equity and positive youth development, make her an ideal thought partner to lead us in a discussion that will blend research, theory, and practice. Dr. Williams will be followed by Julia Hillengas, Executive Director of PowerCorps. Julia boasts extensive experience building adolescent-based national service and volunteer partnerships. She has been an educator, she's been a coach, a community organizer, and a steward of programs that fundamentally center, support, and lift youth in workforce development spaces, among other places. Julia will demonstrate what it actually looks like to build a workplace, a workforce, and culture that centers youth and promotes belonging. If you can't already tell, we are beyond delighted that you are all here, and also that we are joined by Dr. Williams and Julia Hillengas. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. Williams for the first portion of our program, thanking all of you again for your attention and reminding you to get in that chat, raise a hand, feel free to engage along the way. Dr. Williams.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. And if you could give me a thumbs up to let me know if you see my slides. Yes, okay, great. Uva, I can see you. Now let me minimize all these boxes. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I appreciate the introduction. I want to acknowledge and appreciate Uva for inviting me into the space to be with all of you. I am Joanna Williams, and as you heard, I am at Search Institute now as Senior Director of Research. To Roderick, hopefully you've heard of Search Institute because it's actually located in Minneapolis, Minnesota, so in the Twin Cities. Although I am actually a New Jersey native and am excited to be back in my home state for the past 3.5 years. I live in Piscataway, close to Rutgers University. So I'm here today to talk a little bit more about building belonging in the workplace and building really an adolescent-friendly culture. And most of my work really from, the academic work I've done, but all of the years that led up to the work that I did, which a lot of it was in Philadelphia in positive youth development settings. I think I've just come to a position where I care deeply about adolescents, how we support them, how we view them, how we sort of honor the contributions that they have the capacity to make. So I'll talk about belonging, but hopefully you hear these sort of meta messages about, how we can sort of think about including and supporting young people more broadly. So let me begin by saying a little bit more about Search Institute. We are an applied research organization. We are a nonprofit focused on positive youth development and advancing equity for young people. We do our work in collaboration with schools and youth-serving organizations to conduct applied research and design solutions that, again, are centered on advancing equity and creating environments where all young people can thrive. We really do this work by partnering with folks who are actually on the ground and serving young people. And we believe deeply that the kind of questions that we're asking are informed, I think, most accurately by people who are on the ground. So we benefit from the intersection of thinking about research and rigorous research, as well as the voices of practitioners and the voices of young people. So we're coming from a place where we understand that there are opportunities and challenges and problems of practice in youth serving settings. And, our goal is to partner with folks to help address some of those and create solutions that might be useful. So I want to actually follow up on the question that Uva asked. So she gave you sort of an open-ended prompt to kind of fill in about belonging in the workplace. And what I want to ask you is this question: what does belonging feel like to you? So if you think about being in any space, whether it's a workplace setting or otherwise, how do you know that you belong? Like, what does that feel like when you feel like you belong in a setting? And you can go ahead and post a word or a phrase in a chat, whatever comes to mind. Okay, so I'm seeing a few people posting. Thank you. We've got safe, welcome, engaged, and secure, being respected by default without having to prove myself. Thank you, Tess. Respected again. Thank you, Jamie. Let's see what else comes up for people. Yes, encouraged to be myself, style, quirks, and all. Thank you, Julia. Feeling that your work is valued and respected. Thank you, Megan. Collaboration, respect, trust, support, accepted. I feel like, Rob, you've seen my slides already. So some of these words will come up on my slides as well. And then people are kind of doubling down on some of what others have said. So lots of affirmations of what you've already shared. I have two kids. My daughter is 12, and she's often sort of very interested and curious about what I'm working on. So I was telling her about this presentation, and I just asked her, how do you know when you belong? What does that feel like to you? And she said, I feel like it's easy. I wrote down, and, her ears would be burning because she loves when I talk about her. But she said, I feel like I can connect and I can laugh and I can share. And it's not that hard to do if I feel like I belong. So it's just a sense of ease around being yourself. She also mentioned that everyone in a group feels good when people feel like they belong. So it was beyond just how she felt as an individual. It was really about the sense of this collective ease that people have. Okay. Belonging it's really a fundamental human need that we all have. As you see on the slide, belonging is rooted in our biology, and it's necessary for survival. If we think about how we sort of survive and move beyond surviving to thriving, part of that is rooted on the connections that we have to other people. So we need to feel connected to people and to spaces, to aspects of our identity in order to go beyond surviving, but really to thrive. So it's something that's fundamental to us as humans. On the academic side, people have talked about belonging as this feeling that we're integral and we're needed in the spaces and communities where we spend time. That could be with, our families or friend groups. It could be in, school settings or work settings in communities, wherever those spaces are where you're spending time. But we feel integral, and we also feel needed, like, we have a purpose for being there. And I think what's important about belonging, why I asked about it as a feeling, is we can think about it as like this sense. So we can, ask people and sort of measure belonging in a particular situation, but oftentimes it's this deeper sense that we all have, that we know it when we have it, and oftentimes we know it when we feel like we don't belong in a space. We can just sort of tell, even if we can't articulate it really well. So belonging matters. And here's what you said in the chat already. If we think about terms like feeling safe and supported, when we have a strong sense of belonging, we often feel more safe. We feel like we have support from others in those spaces. We feel more engaged, which is important for thinking about workplace settings. We often report feeling more satisfied when we have a strong sense of belonging. We feel accepted and respect came up for a lot of you. And we feel connected to other people. And we also feel a sense of commitment. So this idea of feeling kind of engaged and committed, I think, is meaningful when we understand supporting adolescents in workplace settings. So if they feel like they belong, they may be more engaged, and they may be more willing to kind of stay the course, particularly when things get hard. So now I want to move into talking about one of my favorite topics, which is adolescent development. So I'm going to talk about why belonging matters from a developmental perspective. And to begin, I'm going to borrow from some of the work of my colleagues at the UCLA Center for the Developing Adolescent. So you heard mention of the National Scientific Council on Adolescence. We are sort of an outgrowth of the UCLA Center for the Developing Adolescent. UCLA CDA supports our work of the council, and the council is comprised of about 15 or 16 academic researchers who come from different disciplines, but all believe in the power of adolescence. So here's how we talk about the science, and this work comes from the center as well as our partners at the Frameworks Institute. When I talk about adolescence, I'm talking about a pretty broad period of time from about age 10 to 25. So there's lots of changes happening over that 15 or so years, but we think about it in relation to kind of early onset markers, like certain pubertal changes that we can observe. And we're talking about extending into what we might refer to as young adulthood, so the mid-20s. What's most important, I think, is that adolescence is a period of remarkable growth and opportunity. So there's a lot of dynamic change that happens between 10 and 25, and that brings with it a lot of opportunity. It's a period of time when we're learning to make decisions, we're learning to manage our emotions, we're starting to forge deeper connections with peers and others in our communities. I will be coming back to each of these points over the course of my presentation. It's also an important period of discovery. So we start discovering and trying new things. We're able to learn from and adapt to the world around us. We're forging a sense of who we are and who we aspire to be. So identity exploration is central, which I'll talk about more in a moment. And finally, adolescence is a time when we build resilience, we develop interests and passions, we start to shape meaningful goals that help inform, the choices that we make as we move throughout adolescence and then into adulthood. So I think workplace experiences for adolescents have meaning beyond the, present experience. All of those experiences, young people make meaning of them and use them to inform, their interests, their next steps, and their future goals as well. Okay. I am not a neuroscientist, but I am privy to the neuroscience as a researcher, and many of our council members do study adolescence from sort of a neuroscience perspective. But I want to acknowledge some of what we know about adolescent brain development, because I think it also affirms some of what I just shared about the promise of this period. We know that as adolescents' brains are developing, they are really responsive and adaptive to settings and experiences. So they're taking in and processing a lot of information in the spaces where they're spending time. One of the beauties of this period is that young people are able to think flexibly and creatively. So when we look at things like, processing speed or working memory, the ability to kind of hold information in our minds and work with it in the moment, adolescents are much better and much faster and much more nimble in doing things like that compared to older adults or younger children. So that's an opportunity to think about, being creative and innovative. They're able to think more outside of the box compared to adults. Adults might have a leg up on like building factual knowledge and thinking about wisdom from experience, but adolescents really have this ability to sort of think nimbly and flexibly, which is important. And the last piece that's also critical and related to sort of neurobiological development is that adolescents are especially tuned into social cues. So they're often paying attention to social information. The parts of our brains that are developing that process social inputs are often really sort of active during that period of adolescence. And so social cues and social information takes on a whole new meaning during this period relative to what we experience in childhood and what we experience later in adulthood. And this matters. So this matters when we start thinking about belonging. If we're more tuned into social cues as an adolescent, this means we're also more sensitive to rejection and exclusion. So creating spaces where adolescents feel a sense of belonging becomes especially important. So we really need to think about what kind of cues and sort of messages are they hearing in those spaces? What are they making meaning out of? And are we sort of creating spaces where belonging is kind of fostered and really cultivated? And are we thinking about the kinds of cues that young people might receive, and it could be totally unintentional, that would sort of heighten their sense of, I'm not sure I fit in this space. So if they're really attuned to it, we need to kind of go out of our way to make sure we're fostering belonging in these spaces. Another important part of adolescence is this process of identity exploration. So understanding who we are and where we fit in are aspects of identity development. And this is a core task in adolescence and emerging adulthood. So figuring out who we are also means figuring out where we fit in. You know, who are my people? Where do I have that sense of belonging? Who am I now? Who do my friends and coworkers think I am? And who do I aspire to be in the future? All of that has, I think, relevance for thinking about belonging and experiences in workplace settings. I am going to give one more shout out to my colleagues at the Center for the Developing Adolescent for a graphic that I often use, and we use it in our work as a council. And this just acknowledges some of the key developmental needs that adolescents have. So during adolescence, we need safe and satisfying ways to explore the world, to take healthy risks, and test out new ideas and experiences. And something like starting a new job, we can think about that as an opportunity to try something new. We might not think about it as a risky behavior in a negative way, but going into a workplace for the first time is something that gives a young person an opportunity to explore and try something new. Young people need real-world scenarios like workplace experiences to start practicing and strengthening their decision-making skills, start working on emotion regulation, particularly when they're encountering challenges. They need opportunities to develop a sense of meaning and purpose by contributing to peers, families, and communities. And being part of the workforce becomes another opportunity to contribute and to develop a sense of purpose. Adolescents need positive ways to earn respect and social status, both among peers as well as adults. So as many of you have already said, feeling respected is an essential element of belonging, and is also something that is like developmentally salient for adolescents in particular. They need opportunities to have ways to help define personal values, goals, and identity, which I've talked about, and that can come from workplace experiences. And finally, they need warmth and support from parents and other caring adults. So in much of the rest of my time, in just a moment, I'm going to be talking about relationships as a key ingredient for supporting belonging in the workplace. Before I get there, let me just summarize a little bit. If I'm thinking about an adolescent-friendly workplace that is fostering belonging, I'm thinking about a space that supports autonomy and agency and gives young people opportunities to contribute. So, you know, getting a job and being included in a workplace setting is one thing, but feeling like your voice is actually respected and understood and heard can go a really long way in fostering belonging. Part of that includes asking about young people's interests and goals and recognizing that beyond their job responsibilities, they also are, you know, we're all sort of human and have things that we care about. So showing that you are sort of interested in young people beyond their work-related responsibilities can also foster a sense of inclusion and affirmation and belonging. I've already mentioned respect a couple of times, but actively working to cultivate respect, understanding what that means from the perspective of the young people that are your coworkers is just as important as you know, defining from an organizational perspective what respect means. Scaffolding learning and decision making, because these are skills that adolescents are still, you know, we all need opportunities to practice, and so they're still working on, you know, mastering and building those skills as well. That's coupled with normalizing struggles and mistakes. For any of us starting anything new, it's often we're going to make a lot of mistakes. Adolescents, in their ability to kind of think quickly and make quick decisions, may also make mistakes. But sort of conveying that that is something that is normal, we all go through it, can foster a sense of belonging. And then finally, like I said, what I'm going to spend the next 7 minutes or so talking about is this idea of building relationships and why it's so important. Okay, so let me go back. I think here we go. There we go. Okay, so at Search Institute, we talk about a particular kind of relationship. We all, I think, understand what a relationship is, a connection to another person, but some relationships are simply there to be practical or transactional. We've spent a lot of time at Search Institute thinking about what we call developmental relationships, and I will show you a definition of that on the next slide. But this has sort of come from over a decade of work in partnership with practitioners and youth-serving organizations. This has been informed by the voices and experiences of thousands of young people, as well as parents and family members. And then it's also built on kind of the science of relationships. So we put a lot of time into trying to think about what are the key ingredients of relationships that make them developmental. So what I mean by a developmental relationship is this. These are close connections through which young people discover who they are, gain abilities to shape their own lives, and learn how to interact with and contribute to the world around them. So I'll let you look at the definition for just a moment. So they're close connections in which young people discover who they are, gain abilities to shape their own lives, and learn how to interact with and contribute to the world around them. And part of the reason these are developmental relationships is because they're meeting youth's developmental needs that I've talked about already. So they're supporting identity exploration, they're supporting agency, and they're supporting the cultivation of a sense of purpose. So developmental relationships, I think, go beyond, again, just sort of knowing somebody, but it's really about thinking about is the other person growing from this relationship? And they're mutual, they're bidirectional. So to be in a developmental relationship with a young person means that we are also growing as well. And developmental relationships can be between adults and youth. They can also be between young people as well. So at Search Institute, in our over a decade worth of studying and defining developmental relationships, we have identified 5 elements that have 20 actions associated with them that are kind of the key ingredients of developmental relationships and that make relationships powerful in young people's lives. So the elements are listed here. Each one has its own colorful leaf associated with it. And on the next slide, I will break them down. So the core elements, though, I'll say first are expressing care, challenging growth, providing support, sharing power, and expanding possibilities. Now let me show you what I mean by that. So expressing care. I want you to show me that I matter to you. So this means being dependable, listening to me, believing in me, showing warmth, and encouraging me. So if you think about in a workplace setting, what that might look like, we can think about the kind of behaviors that would sort of cue young people in to show that we care about them. I will say in a lot of our survey research with youth and adults, this is probably the biggest area of discrepancy where young people say, you know, that adults are like moderately expressing care, while adults say that they are expressing care at really high levels. So I think sometimes, you know, we as adults need to think about, are we doing the things in the ways that young people actually know that we care about them? Challenging growth is the second area. This is about pushing me to keep getting better, expecting my best, helping me stretch, holding me accountable, and helping me reflect on failures. And again, this connects back to some of those developmental needs that I mentioned earlier, need to sort of try new things, need to be able to make mistakes without being penalized right away. So adolescents are often going to be making mistakes as they're trying new things, but we need to then turn those into opportunities for learning and to sort of reflect on, you know, what might happen the next time, especially as they're learning new skills in a workplace setting. Providing support is about helping me complete tasks and achieve my goals, helping me navigate, advocating for me, setting boundaries. So developmental relationships aren't just about sort of being nice and caring all of the time. They're also about meeting needs through having high expectations, setting boundaries, and that sort of thing. Sharing power becomes particularly important for young people. Treat me with respect and give me a say. I think workplace settings are a place where we can really respect adolescents' perspectives and provide opportunities for them to share their voice and to have their ideas be heard and acted upon. And then finally, expanding possibilities is about connecting me with people and places and resources and opportunities that help broaden my world and help me meet my goals. So connecting people to opportunities beyond the resources that may be available in a work setting is important, because as we're thinking about adolescents now, we want to support them now, but they're also growing into adults. So adolescence is sort of a developmental period that moves into adulthood. So we want to make sure that our young people have connections that will help them think about decisions and paths forward as they move through the workplace setting that they're currently in. Okay, so from our lots of research that we have in developmental relationships, we know that when they're intentional, inclusive, and equitable, they're related to a host of positive outcomes. So you can see a number of them listed here. Our research is done in schools as well as in community settings. I think some that are really salient now are thinking about things like civic engagement and participation. We know from our research as well that young people who experience strong developmental relationships feel more connected to the settings in which they're in. So that's a really critical element of belonging. In some of our research on workforce development programs with I would call them older adolescents or emerging adults between ages 18 and 25, when they report having strong developmental relationships with near peers, so that might be coaches or staff members who are, similar age range to them, they say that they can make more progress towards their education and career goals. They're more committed to kind of giving back to others who are coming through the same pathway. They feel more efficacious to changing systems, and they feel much more deeply connected to the spaces that they're in. So developmental relationships, again, I'll just say, we know are critical for fostering belonging in workplace settings for adolescents of all ages. In case you're interested in learning more about developmental relationships, I want to note that Search Institute has a resource hub. There's a ton of information that's freely available that's specifically on developmental relationships that includes activities on, for example, you can see here approaches to challenging growth or to expressing care, learning to get to know about other people in your organization. So you're welcome and invited to visit our website and our resources hub to find out more about the resources that we have available. And with that, I just want to say thanks again to Spring Point for inviting me into this space. And I think now I'm turning it back over to Uva to take any sort of immediate questions that we have in the moment.
Sure. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Williams. Lots to reflect on and a few early comments in the chat. We want to just open the floor for a few minutes. If there are any pressing questions, thoughts, anything that you would like to address now, we'll have more time a little bit later on in our session after we've heard from Julia as well. But in the moment, if you have any thoughts and want to just raise a digital hand or, your live hand, or just let us know. Or put it in the chat. We'd love to answer those questions now.
Sorry, I'm not moving to get my hand that quickly. This is Marty. Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. You had two great tools that I've used in the past that I just want to see if you still have, like a quiz you are relative to the 5 areas. And it was, I think, very informative. And the other was this thing like that identified people that played that developmental relationship in your life. It was like, I don't remember what it was called, but do those two things ring a bell with you, and are they still available? They were great.
Yes, the first one you cut out just a moment, but we do have like a relational checkup tool and sort of assessing relational culture in organizations too. We have a bunch of tools on our website. I will put in the chat a link to the resources hub. And some of them are tools where you can do an assessment if you are a staff person, and others are for young people to sort of report on who they have developmental relationships with. So I'm happy to paste a link in the chat to those.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. And thank you, Marty. Any other questions or pressing thoughts that you would like to share in this moment? There was a question in the chat a little bit earlier about whether or not the slides would be available. So just a reminder that you will have access to those slides as well as Julia's. So at this point, it might be a really good time to transition to Julia. Dr. Williams, we will come back to you as well after we've heard from Julia and open the floor for both of you to share space with our participants. But right now, we're going to turn it over to you, Julia, for your thoughts. I think it might be helpful to just expand on the context setting, the idea was to think through some of the research that Dr. Williams shared with all of you, and now to have a conversation with Julia, who will talk a little bit more about how she has implemented or practices, right, belonging in the workplace within her own organization as she and her team build a culture of belonging. So with that said, we'll turn it over to you, Julia, for your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Uva, and thanks everyone at Spring Point for having us and pairing us up with Dr. Williams. So, well, I just shared that we use our research regularly. Just last week at a staff meeting, we're working through some things with a whole staff team of about 30. So for folks who aren't familiar with PowerCorps PHL, this is why we exist. We are rooted in Philly, started about 11 years ago, to really tackle issues of youth unemployment, correlated youth violence, and then the needs of the city of Philadelphia at large to try and push to be a more progressive city on climate resiliency and sustainability and quality of life and all those things. And so we really see our mission as, yes, connecting people to careers, but also advancing community at large, and that we can do those things together. And in fact, doing those things together enriches both efforts. Written into our mission and value statement is how we do that. And I just highlight that last one, that this was written about 6 years ago, but still holds true today, is something our staff really think about is authentic relationships, continual self-reflection, and knowing that all of that is hard work. And for folks who know our crews, we do green space maintenance out. And so we do physical hard work, but also that emotional and relational hard work that Dr. Williams talked about is really critical and sometimes is tough to do, right? More largely, sort of theoretically, conceptually, what we do is something that we've started to talk about as equity-centered workforce development, as we've looked back on sort of 10 years of trying things, learning from them, refining, evolving, and really have these pillars to the work. That the link at the bottom, which I think is also shared in the email that went out to folks, is a template that we published last year that really goes into each of these pillars. For the purposes of today, we're really just going to focus on these three. But like I said, it's free to download. You can take your time and read it later. And very concretely, what we do in terms of the programming that we run in Philadelphia are these three phases. And I'll say that we started with the one in blue. We call it Foundations. It's what you would imagine. It's 10 young people, staff person, their team. They're learning, what people call soft skills or essential skills in a classroom. They're doing on-the-job training out at work sites, and then they choose into careers. So that's what we call career training. So they choose between many of the tracks that you see above there in green. And that was working for us for, about 6, 7, 8 years. And then we hit the pandemic and realized that we were starting to turn away the very young people who used to be successful in PowerCorps, and the very young people that we specifically want to recruit, which are 18 to 30-year-olds from Philly, primarily from Black and Brown communities, and primarily justice involved. And so both our alumni who are on staff, as well as the young people who it wasn't working for, started to help us understand what else was needed, right? In the past 4 years, a lot has changed. And so that's actually how I came up with the thing in yellow, trust. So it's like a pre-PowerCorps initiative, and really focused on healing, connection, and support. And that's really newer for us as we start to iterate that. But it really came out of listening to folks, hearing what they needed, and trying to respond to the shifting needs of what we're seeing from young people through the pandemic. And I'll say that first cohort of young folks who went through the trust programming, they named the program and they came up with a logo for it that we use today. It's what I use in all of our grant reporting and grant writing now. But I didn't name it, right? Our staff didn't name it. It was the young people who named that initiative. This is what it looks like in person. So in trust, it's really about connecting to our food sources through urban agriculture, and then connecting with each other. Really, in the pandemic, folks were really isolated. They felt really lonely. They felt like there weren't a lot of supports, and there literally weren't some of the supports they used to have out there. And so really that connection piece is 50% of the entire program of trust, is like just being in groups and connecting to one another. We also run groups with a licensed clinical social worker, Brother Rob Carter, that serves as therapeutic supports to unpack some of that trauma. But some of it is really just that giving informal space to be together. In Foundations, people are exploring. So the activity that's happening on the left, folks are sitting down. This is usually in the first month when they're in Foundations, and thinking through what an ideal neighborhood park would be like. So as a group, they're coming up and trying to envision a different future, a different reality than what they see in front of them. And then they're going to larger, different green spaces around their city that they may or may not have been to before. You move into our career training tracks, and they're literally on the job doing projects related to very specific careers, whether that's engineering and GIS work you see in the top right, or in tree care work and pruning trees using heavy equipment you see on the left side of the page, and really immersively exploring those options and seeing, like, is this what I want to pursue, right? Is this where I want to go to work more broadly? I think I'm coming back to this slide now to talk about this idea of engaging in human-centered workplaces and partnerships. And I want to give you an example of how we do that, right? It's easy for me to put up a slide and say, these are 6 things you need to do. But we've been doing this quite a bit, and this is something that we use as our own supervisors, right? So we think of our core members, who for us are our clients. So they're young people. They come in, we pay them to learn and to grow and to do work and service. For folks in a stricter work, like a strictly just a workplace, they're your clients. Think of those as interns or your entry-level employees, the youngest people who are on that team. So they're in the center. And yes, I do have a traditional org chart that looks like, all the branches, the way the teams are organized, but the way that we think about where energy and resource flows, this is how we do it. So we put the youngest folks in the center, or with the folks with the least work experience in the center. They're direct supervisors, who for us are, the direct service folks, are pouring into them, right, every day. And that's exhausting. And so what we've tried to reorient managers to is, your job is to pour into those direct service folks, because they're going to need to they need the rejuvenation, they need someone to vent to, they need to process some of these things. They're doing a lot of dynamic relationship work on the spot, on the fly. That's hard to just train, upfront at employee onboarding, and then you get it right away, because every experience is very dynamic. Every young person is very different. So those managers, we've instilled those managers' responsibilities is to really help folks think through and work through that very dynamic workplace. And then the executive team, folks like myself and others on the leadership team, are trying to pour in those managers and make sure that they feel equipped to be having some of those coaching conversations, to really process through and distill, very unique situations that come up, but distill back of, here's a way to approach that, right? Like, let's think about this. Or what sometimes bubbles up is, there's this policy that's really not working, and it needs to be changed. And the last part of that, the stars are the members who then become alumni. So they leave that circle, they go off into the world, they go and work other places. They frankly end up pouring back in to the organization. Those are the success stories that we report out to our funders. But more concretely, a very clear support is Trinae. Trinae, just last month, this is her in City Hall and the mayor's reception room, speaking at a press conference. And she was nominated to speak, that not through us, but through a network of employers that she was connected to through us. So we got told she was speaking. We didn't set it up for her. And in that speech in the mayor's reception room, she shouted out PowerCorps, which was great shine for the program. And that's amazing. But she now works at Philadelphia Water Department and is the president of the Employee Resource Group. So she spent about 2 years with PowerCorps. She experienced the culture that we had of supporting one another, both from staff, but also from her peers. And then she went into an employer partner of ours, who frankly does have a number of our allotments. So that's a place where at Philadelphia Water, other PowerCorps alum from different cohorts who don't necessarily know each other meet at the workplace, and they know that they have some connection there already. But Trinae, who's only a year in at Philadelphia Water, decided to take it a step further and really say, I want this workplace to create a sense of belonging like what I saw at PowerCorps, and I'm going to do something about it. So she volunteered to take on to be the president of the Employee Resource Group. I actually saw her on Friday at a luncheon celebrating the apprentices that are at Philadelphia Water. And she was going around with a clipboard, making sure that every apprentice had seen her email about a survey, employee survey, satisfaction survey, and that they had filled it out. So she's organizing among her colleagues to make sure that it is a workplace that feels outside of PowerCorps, that feels inclusive, that feels like they belong, because they're making up such a big change. And I think really seeing that in action was really powerful for me. Another example of how we do this is an excerpt of a full 1-pager, and you'll get the full handout in the follow-up materials of how we onboard our staff, right? I think for years we've been talking about trauma-informed this, trauma-informed that, and we can say that to staff. but we really need to translate that for them into what does that look like? What does that mean? And so we came up with this grid. And so on the left side is like at our worst, this is what it looks like. I think it's always easier to envision like the extremes, right? And then at our best, this is what we're striving for, knowing that most days we're like in the center, and we're like somewhere in the center, but at least people, staff know what they're shooting for. And they know when they start to hit on like, oh, I need to take a break, or I need to tag someone in, or I need support. If I'm starting to hit in that gray area, then I know that I'm going to need to call on some help. And they know what they're shooting for. And like I said, every day folks are engaging young people who may come in and be super excited to be there, or may come in after a really challenging night of not having a stable place to sleep and not have slept very much, and are expressing that in ways that can be challenging, or not actually about the staff person they're talking to, but it's about what's happening in their lives. And so we're trying to equip our staff with, what do you do in that moment, right? And here, what you're aiming for is to just communicate really directly and kindly. Hey, you cursing at me right now is not how we speak to each other. Do you need to take a walk right now and come back? Right. So we're trying to give examples of, hey, when you're in the moment of something really hard, what are you aiming for? You might not fully get there, but at least you know you're headed in the right direction. I think specifically, I want to highlight the bottom column about communication, being aiming to communicate really clearly, generally, and checking for understanding. And I'll give an example that came up in the last couple of years where I think we're really proud to be to endeavor to be a very inclusive space of all types of young people. We definitely skew heavily to young identified men who are from Black and brown communities, and like I said, 18 to 30-year-olds. And that said, we more and more recently have folks who are using all sorts of different gender expressions, different gender identities. And the idea of pronouns, has come up, and folks that we work with don't always know what that's about. It's not something they've heard before. It's not necessarily something that they've even thought about much before. And so sometimes there can be situations where folks are inadvertently perhaps being offensive, or not helping to helping the community to have a sense of belonging. And so my colleague Jasmine and I, we're trying to work through what's the best way to message the expectations around this and why it's so important without alienating a large group of young people who, to Dr. Williams talked about, really sensitive to rejection, right? Our whole job at PowerCorps is to engage young people who have not felt connected, have not felt like they belong someplace, and provide that space for them. And so we walk this really interesting tightrope of wanting to embrace folks where they are. And I think we say that a lot, and then try to figure out how to get them to another place, right? And so I say we, Jasmine and I sort of work through like what are we trying to get at? Like, why is this important that people understand why pronouns are important? What is the actual genuine message and expectation that we're trying to convey? And what we came back to is like this, and this is literally how we rolled it out to 100 young people, and even staff who of all ages. We have staff from 19 years old to over 60, and some folks have varying degrees of familiarity with the why behind pronouns of, hey, we have staff people today who prefer to go by their middle name. That it doesn't matter what's on their W-2s and their tax forms. We call Mr. Tim by Mr. Tim, whether that's their legal first name or not. We have young people who ask to go by a nickname. We don't ask them why their nickname is this and not that. And we honor that. And so the message that we sent out was, we call people what they ask to be called, because that's a way to honor them. And literally just naming it in that way and relating it in that way meant that it took a lot of pressure and anxiety and sort of like a politicization out of pronouns. And we stopped having the issues, right? We stopped having the issues of young people feeling not included, or feeling offended, or feeling like someone was out to get them. And we started there. And yes, then you go deeper about things, but we had to start with what's the core issue, was that it was creating a space that made people not feel like they belong, who are part of our community. And that it's a really actually relatable issue, because we have many young people who don't go by their government name, and to relate that to pronouns really made sense for folks. And they got it. They're like, oh yeah, I don't want to be doing that, but they're doing it inadvertently. And then you go there. So really, when we think about meeting people where they are, I think to me, it really boils down to that thing on the bottom right of being clear and being genuine about what you're trying to, like, why you're trying to communicate something, or why there's a certain expectation. And then checking that with folks and checking that with others to make sure, are we conveying this clearly? Like we didn't get up there to lecture about queer rights, and this was two queer staff people figuring this out, right? But we really wanted to convey it's about belonging and about your membership in this community, making sure you have a responsibility to help other people feel like they belong, just as you do, right? Closing out, I want to go back to, I showed this as what our programming looks like, but this is really what's happening in each of those phases of PowerCorps, right? So harkening back to Dr. Williams' concepts, the primary focus of trust is connection. We're bringing folks in, it's really low stakes. We run 5 sessions a week. Whatever you come to, that's what you get paid for. Whatever you don't come to, it's not punitive. We just call you and say, hey, we missed you. Can we see you tomorrow? Right. And people opt in. Sometimes they come once a week. We try to get them to come twice a week, but really easing folks into what they're comfortable with in a social connection setting. And Foundations is about exploration. And that's actually a thing that is, I've talked a lot about this with the Spring Point folks. It's like, that's actually one of the hardest things for us to fundraise for, is to create a space that is not about jobs, that is not about certifications. And yes, they get some of those things there, but it's really about letting young people who didn't have the opportunity to explore all the things that they might like to do, or they're not sure if they like to do. And often we have folks go through multiple different, training tracks before they land on the thing that they actually want. And so if you think of this in like a college setting, this is like your freshman and sophomore year. You're figuring out what you want to major in. You might change it a couple times, try something out. And that is such a critically important phase for us. And yet it is one of the hardest things for us to get funding for, because it's not these sexy metrics of, 85% of our graduates go to the water department. Like, it's easy. Green is easy to fundraise for, right? And then the green is choice, right? So we create these tracks. You have to, when you're in that blue phase, you have to apply into them. You decide what you want to apply into or not apply into. And in some cases, if there's nothing that you want to do, we work with you to figure out a different option, right? So, but that's really having the young person practice what it is to see options before them, try something on. And like I said, it is not uncommon. Actually, it's by design that some folks will try green storm infrastructure, do that for a whole 6 months. They could be hired by the water department that just say, actually, I don't want to do this. Can I come back and do solar instead? And we say, sure, right? Like, that's the whole point of why we exist. And so, this is my contact information. I'm happy to talk more about it. But like I said, just going back to, you'll get this full page, hopefully it's helpful for you. And then you can definitely download. There's a multi-page PDF around the implementation of what it looks like to apply these to your own settings, these pillars. So with that, we'll stop sharing the screen.
Julia, thank you so much for that share. I'll pause and see if there are any pressing questions before we ask Dr. Williams to join you on the virtual floor and we open it up for additional questions. Any thoughts or comments? I'm toggling between 2 screens, so forgive me looking around. Anything that might come up more pressing in this moment. Maybe as you are chewing on your reflections and your reactions, I agree with you, Maurice. Thank you. I'll ask Dr. Williams to unmute as well. And while we have both, let us know if anything is coming up for you that you would like to find out about. I see, is it Marie?
Yeah.
Yes.
Marie, do you want to unmute and just kind of tell us your question and add any color or context that you think would be helpful?
Sure. So I'm representing Hand to Paw today, and we have a cohort-based model with our young people. And we've gone back and forth with trying to identify, if we're trying to prepare people for the workplace, is there a certain point where if you don't show up to your internship placement with us, that we just ask you to stop coming, or like kind of acknowledge that you're not as interested as we thought you were. But I think it's interesting how you brought up it's kind of an opt-in model. So come get paid for when you do arrive. But what I'm curious about is how that impacts the ability to form relationships in that cohort if there's not continuity of coming every day when everybody else is there.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So our main thing that we started with was that center thing, Foundations, is a cohort-based model. The cohort-based model is really strong in developing, community and developing culture. And so we didn't want to let go of that. The opt-in model we developed during the pandemic because folks just weren't able to meet that, and there was like too much too soon, right? And so we really see trust as the opt-in model being this like warm up, and it's almost like it's like dangling these carrots in front of folks to say, you really want this feeling, you want this connection, you want this community, and you might have to ease into it at first. And so that's the space to let people sort of ease into it. Once they get into other programming, to your point, there is an expectation that you have to be there a certain amount of days, especially if you're talking about internships and all of those things. And some of the hardest things that our staff wrestle with is, I think on Dr. Williams, the first two columns, the first two leaves are about expressing care, but also helping people grow. And those can feel like they're in tension with one another, but sometimes the best thing we can do for folks is say, right now is not the right time for you. You're telling us that, you're showing us that, we're checking in and asking you that directly. And when that becomes the case, you know, what we then say is like, well, what are the options to return? So we have many folks who it wasn't the right time the first time around. Actually, today we have someone who was 18 years old in our very first cohort. She made it about 3 months in, and it wasn't the right time for her. She came back. We're now in cohort 22, and is coming back now, and it's the right time for her. So we have this open door of like, hey, if it's not the right time, what do you need for it to be the right time later? So we have an open door policy, but there's a point at which you just have to hold the expectation and lay that out for someone.
Thank you for that, Julia. I'm sorry, did you have a follow-up to that question, Marie?
No, that was very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. I see Megan has her hand up. Megan, do you want to unmute and share your thoughts?
I do. Thank you. First, hand to Paul, love you guys. Second, I have a similar question. So I work as the operations director at CB Community Schools, which works with, it's a high school for kids in the child welfare and juvenile justice systems. And one of the things that we really try to do is get them prepared, really, for life after high school. And it's hard because we don't have as much time with them as we really need to teach them everything they need to know. And one of the things we stress is, you know, when they go out and apply for jobs at grocery stores or wherever they're going, you know, that they have to be dependable and that they have to show up. And if they're not going to show up, they have to make sure that they call or let somebody know that they're not going to be there. And so I feel like there's a tension between giving them the number of chances that they need to be ready to opt in, and also how many chances are you going to give somebody before you move on to the next person. And I know they lose a lot of jobs because, you know, a lot of employers need a person to come in. And so we struggle with that. And now that I know about PowerCorps, which I had not heard of, how do you determine the people that are right for your cohorts, and how do you find people? Because this would be a good transition time for a lot of our students. They're not really necessarily ready to enter the quote unquote traditional workforce because they haven't learned a lot of these skills, or they haven't at least incorporated them into their day-to-day practices. But something where they can try things out, you know, see what they like, what they don't like, might really work a lot better for them.
Yeah, I'm happy to connect. So we take referrals from folks like yourselves, from youth, from other community-based organizations, and we also have open applications. So I'm happy to connect and give your staff that. And I think, you know, what you're hitting on is and why I think Spring Point is so motivated in this space is like we all are operating in a deficient environment for young adults, right? So
right.
Some young adults get to go to college and skip school, skip class, and they don't get kicked out of college. And other young adults are expected at 18 to go and hold down a job, and there's something wrong with them if they can't figure out how to show up on time. And so the fact is that our environment, our society is not structured in a way that allows people to learn. That's the only way that you learn some of these things is through practice, right? It's like a sport. you have to practice at a job. And for some of us, we got to, as a YMCA camp counselor when I was 15. So I wasn't the best camp counselor at the time, but I learned how to be a better worker by not being a great worker when I was younger. And I think that's true for many of us. And so just creating those spaces to practice is really what's needed. And then when people mess up, they do need another space to be like, okay, I learned something from that. Let me try it again. It is really difficult because we don't live in a world that has an abundance of those opportunities for all young adults. I think that's probably what drives much of Dr. Williams' research into this,
Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to take up all your time, but our big dilemma is that our students come to us with a background of trauma, both past and perhaps ongoing, and they have very unstable situations. And we just try to get so much done in such a short period of time that we've actually even talked about the idea of like a 13th grade, type thing. And this sort of seems like a 13th grade in a way, because it gives them a transition space. So I mean, I'm thrilled I signed up for this because, I feel like this is a great opportunity for a lot of our students. Most of them don't have like that interested adult that kids need that's going to keep them, teach them how things work, etc. So, I'm really happy, and I hope to connect. Happy to hear from you, and hope to connect after this is over. So, thank you.
Thank you, Megan. We have a question and just a thought by Lauren. Lauren, do you want to read it out for us or tell us a little bit more about what you have in mind?
Yeah, definitely. I hope my audio is staying somewhat stable. I've been having some issues today. But I thought what was really interesting was when Dr. Williams was just talking about express care, that part about show me that I matter to you in the workplace. And I think what's really interesting to me, being someone who's kind of a millennial Gen Z cusper, is that there's different variations of that between like the broad spectrum of my friends. And so some people very much like to detach that kind of work-life balance where it's like when I'm at work, I'm at work. And then when I leave work, that's my personal life. And so then you have managers who might be dealing with people from these different generations that think so differently about what they want in the workplace. So I was just curious, like, how can managers even do that when they might be dealing with people that are so different constantly, that are requiring different things?
Mm-hmm. Dr. Williams, your thoughts?
Sure. Hi, Lauren. I appreciate your question. And a couple of things come to mind. I do think, so we see this discrepancy. It's often between adults who are in educational settings or youth serving orgs and young people themselves. I think what's important to understand, knowing there's going to be individual variation, which I feel like could be a whole other discussion. So not everybody is in the same place and, experiences these things in the same way. I do think if we're talking about fostering belonging, then understanding where a young person is coming from, understanding a little bit about, how they want to feel connected, is what's important. And we can only do that by asking rather than assuming. So I think checking in and finding ways to create spaces for employees who are adolescents or young adults to, share something about what their, sort of personal values and style. And there's a lot of like employment related things and tools that we do to sort of understand, where somebody's coming from and how they can be supported. And that's true for other dimensions of the relationships framework, or even something like respect, for example. It doesn't mean the same thing to all of us. I think for some of us, like having a sense of respect in our lives could be like a life or death kind of issue. And I don't mean to sound extreme, but I think with the various young people that I've had the opportunity to work with and get to know, for me, growing up, respect was about like listening to your elders and making sure you're not, speaking out of turn or interrupting. But for lots of other young people, or even people that I'm connected with in my own personal life, respect means something different. And so understanding a little bit more about what the needs of our younger colleagues are is the best way that we can sort of foster those needs. One other point that I'll make is about this having a trusted, caring adult somewhere or a near peer somewhere is important. ideally, if we're moving into a place in our lives where we're spending a lot of time in a workplace setting, so when we're talking about older adolescents and younger adults, if they're spending a lot of time at work, then I do think it's important for opportunities to connect with a near peer or an adult in that workplace setting. But ultimately, I think the ideal is that they have those connections somewhere in their sort of larger ecosystem as well.
Thank you for that, Dr. Williams. As we give our participants just another minute to think about additional questions, I am curious about the application of a racial lens, right? A racial equity lens to the work that you do. So if you could just touch on how that then fits into this work and the sense of belonging. And then Julia, your population tends to be diverse as well. How does that come up in the work that you do as well? I know that you focus on that equity piece pretty strongly as well. So if you could both comment on that, that would be helpful.
Yeah. So I'll start with kind of moving from broad to narrow to what we're like getting ready to do in our work. At a broad level, when we look in just basic survey data at developmental relationships, when we look across racial and ethnic identities and other aspects of sort of identity or, demographic categories, we see a consistent pattern that when young people say they have stronger developmental relationships, it's consistently related to positive outcomes. However, I think that I've had conversations since I've been at Surge with young people, just sharing a little bit about the framework. And I do think we need to think about a couple of things. First is the cultural context in which these terms are being understood. So sharing power, for example, I was talking with a high school student who was saying in her particular culture, she was Southeast Asian, she was like, we are very hierarchical. So if you asked the adults in my family about sharing power, it wouldn't be a conversation that they were sort of open to having. And so thinking about what that means and what it actually might look like, or the kind of phrasing that I think resonates is important. So understanding that whether we're talking about a particular family culture or a larger ethnic heritage culture, we need to think about what some of those dimensions actually sort of mean and how they resonate and how they're experienced. From an equity perspective, we're thinking about it in a couple of ways. One, I think it's important for all young people to have equitable access to strong supportive relationships, but we know that that's not the case. So we have just submitted a research proposal. We hope to get funded to look at, in the context of schools, the experiences of Black students, particularly around disproportionate experiences of punitive discipline. So discipline can be a relational sort of dynamic. It doesn't happen in isolation. It usually happens in the context of relationships. So on the one hand, we know, students in school settings, when they have strong developmental relationships, they report positive outcomes. And then at the same time, we also know that across the country, disproportionality exists, particularly for Black students, around being sort of negatively pushed out of school for disciplinary infractions. So we're trying to understand, what does that mean? If an educator says, of course I support all of my students, and yet you're seeing disproportionality, then how do we sort of bring those two together? Is it about that young people are not being viewed all the same way? So biases that come from adults in spaces, that certainly we know from our research and work that I've done at the national academies looking across systems of adolescence experiences, interpersonal biases are huge. They play a huge factor in creating inequitable access to not only engage in relationships, but to just how we perceive young people. And so I think about the additional layers or barriers that young people from groups that we historically stigmatize or marginalize have to face. So when we talk about sharing power or setting high expectations through challenging growth, it starts with understanding some of our own biases about, are we really understanding that we have all of the same expectations for a young person, no matter their identity or their story or their past work history or involvement with juvenile justice and what have you? And if we're struggling with that, then what's the work we need to do to get to ourselves to a space where we're ready to sort of think about, putting some of those biases in check, bracketing them for a moment to be in relationship with young people. So.
Thank you for that. Julie, I'll ask you to respond, and then we'll go to Rob Sosa or Rosa. What? Rob, do you have your hand up? Okay, mistake maybe?
I do not. I was just feeling everything that Dr. Williams was saying. She had me like in a zone. Go ahead, Dr. Williams. Go ahead.
The zone is a good place to be. Thank you, Rob. Julia, your thoughts on the
I
question?
mean, yeah, definitely everything Dr. Williams said. I think the things that I'd add is we really think about staffing, and that's easier when you have a larger team than when you have, a very small team. And the way that we think, so right now we can do this overnight, but a third of our staff team are alumni of our program. So they're already coming in with experience that no other staff on our team have. And we see that as an asset, the same that we would see a college degree as an asset, right? And we really think about how we hire and what are the assets that we need the whole team to have. So in some cases, it is a formal degree in a certain thing. In some cases, it's lived experience. In some cases, it's cultural fluency, right? In certain cultures, given who we relate to, and and really holding each of those up as where do we need to strengthen on our team, and how do we add that, right? So I think there's thinking about that, and we've had a long journey of trial and error of what's the best way to onboard alumni to a team, and that's like a whole other thing. But really thinking about the skills, experiences, and assets that folks are bringing, and how do you lean into those as a strength, and then value them the same way. And then I think the other thing that Dr. Williams started to hit on, I'm starting to lose the train of thought there, but no, some of it's about also understanding what information do people really need to know, right? So we deal with a lot of folks who have court involvement. We, by nature of what we do, some small number of our team know exactly what's on those records. They actually go to people with court. They're helping them navigate that. But we actually decided that beyond a couple of positions, no one else needs to know that in our staff, because it inherently is going to bias how people interact with folks. And so we also tried to create policies and a work structure that limited how much additional bias that was already coming in. And then we do a lot of collaboration and tone setting of, like, we have a very diverse team. We have people who are certified arborists, who really know things that I do not know about trees, but we all need each other, right? We need all of those assets to make the thing work. And so really adopting that sort of culture in the workplace, and then figuring out how do you put in the parameters to make that real. And some of that's about privacy and confidentiality, and some of that's about training, and some of that's about letting folks work collaboratively on a project and realize like how awesome it is to have this extra skill set that you don't have yourself, right?
Makes a lot of sense. Chaitanya has a thought and a question, so I'll ask her to unmute and share what she's thinking.
Sure, thank you. This has been a great presentation. I was thinking a lot about about your thoughts on how important it is to feel included and how hurtful social exclusion is at this age. But some young people, because of the trauma they've been through, because of whatever their life experience has been, kind of come into adolescence without certain social skills. So they're overly friendly, or they're just really struggling. They don't know how to connect with other youth. And I find, I work with young people who are kind of aging out of the foster care system as a CASA, and they're not often accepted by their peers, right? Because they don't really know those proper social interactions, which just, is even more painful because it's social exclusion on top of what's happening. So how do you create environments where everyone feels included and there's a certain level of tolerance for people who are still learning certain skills, so certain social skills?
I'm happy to share some thoughts. First, I'll just say, from what we know of the science, I think this is an important point, that even if you're talking about young people aging out of care, so 16 to early 20s or so, we know from the science that it is still like an important time for supports and opportunities to kind of learn and build skills and change trajectories. Oftentimes we might think, well, at this point, is it too late? Should we have supported these skills early on? It's not too late. So I think that's an important take-home message. I imagine here there's a combination of making sure there is a near peer or adult advocate, and opportunities to sort of practice in spaces where there's maybe a smaller subset of peers who we all vary in our level of like social sensitivity. I think some young people may have enough sort of empathy, kind of leading with empathy to be supportive of those peers who are struggling to connect socially or sort of express things in ways that aren't kind of alienating themselves. And I think when young people have those peer advocates who can say, you know, I'm giving them a chance and they're sort of modeling for others, that can be a start. Adults then become critical in those spaces as well, both in terms of supporting young people who are feeling the deep hurt that comes from, you know, being rejected or excluded, but also to being able to provide them some feedback about, you know, how they're being sort of received and understood by peers and opportunities for developing some of those skills. It's hard. I think I appreciate that question. I think it can be hard to kind of navigate the whole group set of dynamics. I think Julia was talking before about really the deep work they do in their cohorts with like creating some norms and expectations. So thinking about how you're building a group culture around kind of inclusion and support and ways for young people, all of them, to express when they're feeling, you know, uncomfortable or where they're feeling like, you know, this person is acting in a way that's upsetting to me, so that, you know, it isn't just I'm going to behave and shut down and not say what's going on. I think if you're fostering spaces where there's opportunities to sort of communicate so that you're leaning into some of those challenges and trying to build around them rather than just, you know, shutting down and creating sort of factions or isolated kids, I think that's important as well. So thinking about the culture of the group.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Any other questions that we can address for you before we begin to close out? And if so, certainly put them in the chat or feel free to unmute and just hop in. As you are doing so, as you were speaking, Dr. Williams, you talked about cultivating respect as one of the areas of focus for the work. And I was getting ready to ask you a question around what that could look like in a very practical and concrete way. But then Julia jumped in and provided that example around pronouns and the honoring of names, right? As a direct, I think that in my mind's eye is an easy way to think about how we might be able to build belonging, think about what respect could look like. Sometimes we think the theory is so big that it's difficult to apply in a very practical way. And I think those micro moments and micro decisions can go a long way in creating this culture of belonging. So I got my answer to that question that was kind of salient for me. I'm wondering if you could speak before we leave, Dr. Williams, to what normalizing mistakes could look like from your perspective. Julia spoke to that as well, so I'd love to hear just your final thoughts on that. And then Julia, on your end, you've done incredible work. I am pretty sure as we were preparing for this session, we talked about the fact that sometimes it's not that easy and mistake making is part of the work for adolescents, but also for us as adults who are creating or co-building these organizations. So if you could just think through and help us think about our own mistake making in this process, what you've learned, what we ought not to be afraid of, or anything else that might be helpful for those who are trying to build the right culture. I'll start with Dr. Williams, and then Julia, if you could take us to the end, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I'll open with some research that comes from so higher education settings for students who are transitioning and who are from groups who may be historically underrepresented. What some of the social psychology literature shows is that when older students send like letters or messages saying, hey, I got to college and I struggled for a bit. It was hard. It was a lot harder than I thought, especially compared to high school. And here's what I'm doing now. That actually went a really long way in fostering students' sense of belonging and feeling like, okay, I can do this too. And I think there are ways when you're talking about new employees in a workplace, if they've got, I keep using the word near peers, but people who've just been there a little bit longer, doesn't always have to be an adult who's much older, can be somebody with experience or someone like Julia said, they've brought back some of their graduates who can say, I remember when I started and I remember some of the challenges that I had and I remember some of the mistakes that I made. So starting to normalize as opposed to setting the expectation that you are going to have to be perfect right away. I think that's really important. And I understand going back to, I think it was, you know, Megan who was talking about when young people are not meeting responsibilities of an employer. That's hard. If I could wave that magic wand and make workforce settings more sort of developmentally friendly, we would have some more understanding about opportunities for growth and mistake and trying things out and exploring. That's not the case. And so there are going to be things that do have consequences that are harder to control. But when we do have some control over that setting, if we're able to just talk about and voice that struggles do happen, that sort of makes it feel more tangible. Like I can work through these struggles. People aren't going to kick me out right away. And then the other is, you know, how do we have conversations about repairing harm if a mistake has sort of gone too far? When that has been set as sort of a tone and the culture of the setting, I think that can go a long way too.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your words.
Yeah.
Julie.
Yeah, I mean, we make a lot of mistakes. I think what we've learned along the way is that we're not ever going to be able to upfront give a staff person answers to something. Like, and we definitely went down the route of like, and then we need training this, and then we need training this, and then we need training this. And instead, really trying to drill in who on the staff you have support from when you need it, and what are some of the questions that you can arm yourself with, like 5, like 5 questions, and like really just to be okay with not knowing the answer, and instead like buy yourself some time to one, just process what's going on, buy yourself some time to understand a little bit more by asking more questions from whoever's involved in the thing, whether it's young people or a colleague or what have you. And the one that I've ended up using a lot lately, or I've used a lot as I've learned how to do this, is when there's conflict and you're talking through with one party and, you know, they might be really riled up. Like, this is wrong. I can't believe that this is, and ask them like, well, what would you like to do? And they'll give you the answer in the heat of the moment. And then my next question is, do you think that's going to be effective for what you want and who you're talking to? And that starts to help like bring folks down to really think through like, okay, what is it that I do want? I might be right. I may be so right that no one can deny it, but is it going to be effective to get me what I want? And in a work context, I found that to really be helpful to get people to a place to then sort of then go back and resolve or mitigate or, you know, embrace, sort of resolve the conflict they're having with a colleague, as opposed to, right, there's other types of conflict in personal life that might look a different way. But really to get back to like, yes, you're feeling all these things, you might be absolutely right, but we are in a workplace, and what ultimately is going to get you the goal, you know, that you're looking for has been really helpful, and really just like trying to arm people with questions asked for like with young people, like what's going on, you know, what do you need right now, and then work from there, right? Instead of trying to go in and like someone's really someone's really emotional right now and deciding like this is what they need or this is what they don't need, right? Like to ask those questions and to really embrace that as a first step to then be able to move forward.
Thank you, Julia Hillengas. Thank you, Dr. Williams. I think if we kind of zoom out of this, it's pretty clear that so many of the highlights or the insights you've shared are relevant to all of us in the workforce, right? That so many of these are things that we do for the adults in the workplace, for no matter what our generational footprint might be. But for some reason, when it comes to adolescents, we get a little bit nervous about sharing space, about sharing power, about really centering them in the work as well, when the reality is their needs are as critical as everyone else's. So I really appreciate that you have helped us kind of provide some context around the science behind this, but more importantly, the reminder that belonging is a need, right? A human need that we ought to pay attention to in the workplace. We are beyond thankful for your time with us. For those in the audience, a reminder that we will be sending out a survey along with the slides, so you will have access to all of this information as well as contact information for both of our speakers. With that, we are thankful to the Spring Point team for being with us today, to Witty Gritty for supporting us with the production of this and the recording that will be posted by next week. A few reminders about what's next on Learning Series. Our next learning session will be on May 30th from 2 to 3:30, and will be an exploration of community voice and evaluation. More on that in the next few days. You'll get an invitation, and that, of course, is open to all programs and people beyond our network as well. James Baldwin in Giovanni's room reminds us that perhaps home is not a place, but simply an irrevocable irrevocable condition. I think our speakers have reminded us to consider how our organizational culture, our policies and expectations in the workplace and in the world can create those conditions for adolescents to feel at home, to belong, no matter where they are. We are thankful to all of you and hope you have a wonderful week ahead. With that, we'll give you all of an extra minute of discretionary time and we'll see you at our next session. Take good care.